Hey guys, we're back on Conspiranormal. It's a few days later. And how you doing, Rob?
I am well. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. I'm sweating, but I'm good.
I apologized already. I turned the air conditioner on. Ah,
And as you guys can hear, we do have the guest on the line, someone that we're very happy to come back on at their third time on Conspiranormal. This you have Dr. Heiser. You have joined the three guest club. I'm not quite sure what you get, but
Right.
maybe if maybe you come on for
I
a
might
fifth
get some
time.
hate mail. Yeah, maybe some hate mail.
Yeah, that's always good. We get a lot of that. Maybe we'll get like and we have T-shirts, so maybe we can come up with some an official Conspiranormal smoking jacket or something for you. If you don't smoke, it's just a cool jacket.
I'll take a hoodie or something.
Okay, yeah, that'll work. That'll work for sure. All right, well, we're going to talk about your book, your new book, Reversing Hermon.
Mhm.
And as I was telling you in the part that people don't hear, that this is another of your books that I really enjoyed, really got a lot out of, really helps me understand the Bible and what's in it, just like your previous book, The Unseen Realm, which is a book that I highly recommend if anybody really wants to understand certain themes and what connects some thematic elements in the Bible. But this book is subtitled Enoch, the Watchers, and the Forgotten Mission of Jesus Christ. So I want to just jump into this. And what I really want to do first is kind of define some terms, what a couple of things mean. And that is first the Watchers, what that is, what they are, and also the term Second Temple literature, what that is and what it consists of.
Okay. I'm surprised you didn't ask about Hermon. Your audience is beyond the normal one, if they know what Hermon is. But I guess it's wrapped up with the Watchers. Anyway, Watchers is a term used in Second Temple literature, so we might as well define that while we're at it too. Second Temple Jewish literature is stuff written in the era when the Second Temple in Israel was standing. So if you want to get real precise, that's like 512 BC or something like that, all the way up to 70 AD. So usually people round it off, 500 BC to 100 AD. That's usually, sort of broadly speaking, the Second Temple period. And so you have a lot of material written by Jewish thinkers, Jewish leaders, writers, theologians in that period. And that naturally is partly commentary on the Old Testament. Part of it is, original literature that has to do with Jewish life during the period. But the New Testament writers very evidently read a good bit of that material, especially one book in particular, what we call First Enoch as scholars, more popularly known as the Book of Enoch. There's actually 3 books of Enoch. But, that First Enoch, the Book of Enoch, is right smack dab, in the middle of this matrix in the Second Temple period. So in the Book of Enoch, the term watchers is used, to describe the offending divine beings, the offending sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4. That's Enoch's term for them, or at least the one he uses most often. Now, it's a biblical term as well. It's used in the book of Daniel. It shows up 4 times. So it's not something completely detached in terms of vocabulary from the Bible itself. But that's who the Watchers are, the bad guys of Genesis 6:1-4. And when they descend to earth to hatch their plot, Enoch has them descending to Mount Hermon. And that's where Hermon comes from in the title. That's where they bind themselves with an oath to do the best they can to corrupt humanity and help humanity destroy itself.
Now, present day, Hermon is located still in Israel, or is it kind of in a border region?
Yeah, it's north, like in Lebanon, Syria.
Okay.
It's north of the Holy Land proper, but the foot of Mount Hermon touches, I guess you could say overlaps with the northern boundary of the land that was allotted to the Israelite tribes. So it's right to the north of that.
Okay. Yeah, in the same region where we're having all these problems right now, incidentally.
Yeah.
So what goes around comes around.
There's plenty of blame to go around here, but that is true. I mean, it's part of that geography.
What's the generally accepted date of the Book of Enoch?
Well, textually, the oldest textual evidence we have is the material found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. So that's, we'll just use round numbers, 200 BC. But, scholars figure, well, if we have fragments of it here from 200 BC, it's probably at least 100 years older. So you'll see, people date it to 300 BC. But again, sometime in the Second Temple period.
Okay. And then the second and the third one, which you don't hear too much about, actually, I guess the second one, I guess, what was it, 100s BC? And the third one was probably in the ADs, like 100 AD or something like that.
Yeah, the other two are actually both AD. Second Enoch is written or preserved, I should say, in Slavonic, believe it or not.
Right, right.
There's actually a recent scholarly book out on it, and you don't have to read Slavonic for it. But there's a guy at Marquette who does read Slavonic, and big Second Temple Enoch guy. So he just came out with essentially a collection of essays on that. And the third one, I believe, is in Hebrew, and I think it's it's a little, well, it is a little later than the Slavonic. The original one, the oldest one, I guess I should say, is preserved at Qumran in Aramaic. So that was probably its original composition language.
Okay, but it survived outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It wasn't found with the Dead Sea Scrolls originally, right? It was.
Yeah, Enoch was known from much later material. I mean, eventually it at Qumran you only get fragments in Aramaic. Now it was translated into Greek, so you have Greek manuscript material that's pretty ancient. It's not the whole book, but it's large portions of the book. But the book in its entirety was known to the modern West only through Ethiopic.
Right. Okay.
And that was the Abyssinian church, and that's much later. That's in the modern period that a copy of the full Book of Enoch in Ethiopia was actually brought to Europe.
But it existed in the Ethiopian canon all the way from 300s AD till now, basically. So
yeah, and they still consider it canonical.
Right. Yeah, the only church that does. I'd be interested to find out why that is, but I think that's for another discussion. But so what is the basic story of the sin of the Watchers? What is that sin that they come down and do? And I know we've touched on this before, but I think this is important to kind of reiterate it.
Yeah, they're guilty of several things. I mean, the one that gets the most attention is the violation described in Genesis 6:1-4, with the human women, and as I talk about in Unseen Realm, the book before this one. There are two ways that I think you can parse that passage and still honor the supernatural worldview of the passage. I think anything that doesn't consider the sons of God or the Watchers as divine beings is deeply flawed because it violates the original context of those 4 verses, which is Mesopotamian. And Enoch, again, believe it or not, even though it's post-Old Testament, Enoch actually preserves the original context of Genesis 6:1-4. It sounds a little odd, but if you want to know why, read the book. But you've got that initial issue, but then there's this whole thing about, well, let's take things like the ability to forge metals, or to observe the stars, or something like cosmetics or whatever. Let's use those things and teach humanity how to do these things in such a way that it becomes self-destructive and idolatrous. So the sin of the Watchers that really this book is concerned about is how the Watchers in Second Temple thinking get blamed for depravity. I mean, if you ask the average Christian, hey, why is the world the way it is? Why is it such a mess? The answer you're going to get is, oh, that's the fall. It's Genesis 3.
The original sin concept.
Yeah. If you ask the same question to a first century Jew, that's not the answer you would get. You would get, well, there's 3 reasons why the world is the mess that it is. Yeah, in Genesis 3, we have the beginning of divine rebellion, the beginning of human rebellion. We're estranged from God, and now we're going to die because Eden is no more. So we have a death problem here. That's bad. But we also have what happened in Genesis 6:1-4. And so the depravity of humanity, again, it's bent towards self-destruction, is laid at the feet of the Watchers. And this is why, I mean, we don't get all of that in Genesis 6:1-4, but in Genesis 6:5, we get the statement that every imagination of the heart of man was only evil continually. And what you miss is you miss the backstory, again, that has a Mesopotamian counterpart, but is actually preserved in the Book of Enoch. Let me just pause there. The way we know that, the simplest way to explain that is when you get to 2 Peter and Jude, they refer to the angels that sinned. Angels is plural. Isn't that a profound observation? But you get angels that sinned, and there is no other candidate for a corporate angelic sin in the Old Testament. This is the only passage you can go to. People say, well, what about the third of the angels rebelling with Satan? Well, guess what? There is no such passage in the Bible until you get to the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation associates the third of the angels in combat, with the forces of God, with the birth of the Messiah. It's very clear. You just read through Revelation 12. Right there it is. So this idea of a primeval fall of a third of the angels, that actually comes from Milton's Paradise Lost, not the Bible.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So you only have one candidate for the angels that sin. That's Genesis 6:1-4. And then Peter and Jude both describe the angels that sin as being, imprisoned and kept in chains of gloomy darkness. And Peter uses the verb tartarao to describe this in Greek, and that means sent to Tartarus. Well, That description doesn't exist anywhere in the Old Testament, but it does exist in Mesopotamian material. The idea of the offending in Mesopotamian story, they're called the Apkallu. And the story of the Apkallu accounts for every point of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. They're divine before the flood. Then after the flood, they're hybrid. They're fathered by mortals. Okay, so you have this hybrid thing. They're also called giants. They're sent down to the abyss, again, the bad place in the underworld, as punishment by Marduk. I mean, every element of this is found in the Mesopotamian milieu, and that tells us why Genesis 6, 1 through 4 was written in the first place, because the Apkallu to the Mesopotamians are heroes. They're good guys. What they did was good because they're trying to preserve, the knowledge that the gods had given to humankind, and they want to save, humanity. And boy, we're thankful that they did, because this is why Babylon is the top dog, No, and the biblical version is like, no, wait a minute. What results from this is, certain, peoples that we've later in Israel's history are bent on Israel's destruction, the giant clans and all that stuff. And they're disembodied spirits or demons. I mean, so the biblical writer's like, hold on, fellas, this is not really how to look at what happened here. And that's why you get Genesis 6, 1 through 4, so that Israelite readers would know this was a violation. This was sinister. This was evil. And, in the Mesopotamian story, it's not a coincidence that the skills that the Apkallu had, skills in astrology, skills in forging metals, skills in warfare, skills, in seduction, all of these things are applied in Enoch to the Watchers as instruments by which they use to corrupt humanity and make them even more depraved, to destroy them. It's a program of self-destruction. So we know when Peter and Jude come up with material that isn't in the Old Testament, but is in the Mesopotamian story and is in the book of Enoch, we can see that the book of Enoch preserved the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And it's really important. This is what you call reading biblical literature in its own context.
Yes.
You're going back to primary sources. We're not filtering our Bible through Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, we are going back to primary sources. So that's the second reason why a Jew would say we're all screwed up. And then the third reason is what happens at Babel. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, where the nations are assigned to lesser gods as a punishment. God divorces himself from humanity, puts the nations under lesser authorities who are supposed to be placeholders and administer the nations according to the good justice of the true God. But they don't do that. In Psalm 82, we find out that instead, they abuse their populations. In Deuteronomy 32, later on a few verses, we find out that this is the bunch that seduces the Israelites into idolatry. And all of that, again, look at that. That's Babel, Tower of Babel. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is Babylonian in its context. This is why Babylon is a big deal in both testaments. Babylon becomes a symbol and a metaphor for everything that's bad,
Right.
everything that causes chaos, everything that drives people away, from a good relationship with the true God. It's just, why do you think Revelation has this mystery Babylon concept? Well, it's because Babylon is the bad place.
Mhm.
What else would you call it? This is the perfect thing to call it because everybody knows what that is, except for us, because we're divorced, by millennia, from this context. So you'd get three answers, and in reversing Hermon, I'm drilling down on the second one, the Genesis 6, the Watchers thing, and because look at it this way: if that's what's bad, if that's what corrupts humanity, then logically. When the Messiah shows up, he's not just here to fix the Genesis 3 problem, okay, the fall. He's here to fix all of these problems. Mm-hmm. He is the solution to rolling back, to reversing all of these problems. So all that factored in, that threefold reason for depravity and why the nations are against God and Israel, the whole bit, all of that factors into the Jewish expectation of deliverance through the Messiah. And that's really what reversing Hermon is about. If you had that backstory in your head, as you read through the New Testament, certain things would pop out at you, certain phrases, certain concepts would jump out at you, and you would be compelled to read them in a little bit of a different way, so that you could see, well, okay, Paul wrote this, Matthew did this, Peter did that, the book of Revelation, John does that. If I read that, what they say, in light of this paradigm, in light of this backstory, that is going to direct the way I think about that passage. And it's very evident that the biblical writers knew this story, and they are dropping breadcrumbs, and leaving trails through what they wrote in the New Testament to get you to think like they're thinking, and to give you a heads up, to alert you to what they're really trying to get at.
The men of renown that you mentioned, I guess Gilgamesh would have been one of those.
Yeah,
some of the heroes in Babylonian, Sumerian legend.
the Gilgamesh turns out to be a really pivotal figure for this, because Gilgamesh is mentioned by name in an Enochian text. And that Enochian text means books that aren't First Enoch, but that have a lot of First Enoch material in them. It's an academic term. But the Book of the Giants, also known from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's a name that the scholars give to it because there's giants in it, okay? And Gilgamesh is referred to by name in that text. So here you have, think about it. You've got the name of the Mesopotamian giant, Gilgamesh, in a Second Temple Jewish manuscript. Okay, again, that deals with themes of First Enoch, this Enochian text. And again, if you consider Gilgamesh, he is called Lord of the Apkallu on a cylinder seal. Who are the Apkallu? Well, we just mentioned them a few minutes ago. The Apkallu before the flood were totally divine, and then after the flood they're not. They're a mixture. They're a hybrid, and they all and Gilgamesh is their lord. He's one of them. He's the best one. He's the biggest one. He's Gilgamesh after all, and Gilgamesh is described as a giant. We actually get his dimensions in cuneiform sources. He's like a Goliath figure, if we can use that analogy. And he's an Apkallu. He's a post-flood Apkallu. So hybrid being, giant, where have I seen this before? There it is. It's Genesis 6:1-4. So Gilgamesh is a big deal. And again, it's very clear that the writer of First Enoch was very familiar with Mesopotamian material.
But we weren't familiar with it in Western culture until the 19th century.
Right, because of the decipherment barrier, and this, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I get the question all the time. Well, why didn't Martin Luther teach this, and why didn't Augustine teach this, and John Calvin? And look, it's not because they were dumb and Mike's smart. Okay, let's just clear the air right away. It's not because Mike is so smart. It's because Mike has access to primary sources that they didn't.
Right.
This material is unknown, and if it is known, nobody can read it until the 1800s.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. We have material that they didn't, and that material is from the biblical world.
The Apkallu, I guess they manifest themselves spiritually before the flood, but then after they manifest physically. Is that the gist of it? And then also, do they mate with human women, as is described in the Book of Enoch and in Genesis 6?
Yeah, there's a particular cuneiform text that gives a list of Apkallu. I don't know if you remember this from reading the book, but there's one that gives a list of the Apkallu, and of course, what you have there is you have a name of a post-flood king, and then an Apkallu name next to him, because he's the one who, this is the Apkallu that helped this king, rule, help make him a smart guy and make the right decisions and whatnot. So the Apkallu prior to the flood are only referred to as divine beings, and then after the flood, you have this description that they are of human descent. Is the actual phrase that shows up in this particular tablet. And so, again, this tells scholars that something happened with the Apkallu, that after the flood, they're now part human and part what they were, divine. So you have that issue, and then you have the Apkallu, again, Gilgamesh is the primary example. You have the Apkallu, again, as, I'll just use the word people, okay? Again, Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. So you have figures like Gilgamesh, who are, again, the same percentage, and that's also the same percentage attributed to other Apkallu. The 2/3 thing, as scholars think, is significant because that's the Apkallu, 2/3 Apkallu, 1/3 of human descent, and then you have Gilgamesh with the same 2/3 designation, and Gilgamesh is described as a giant in Mesopotamian material. So, again, all of the elements, I don't want to say mimic or mime, because the Mesopotamian material is the material to which the biblical writer is responding. Evidently the biblical writer knows the story, and Genesis 6:1-4 is offered as a theological polemic or corrective, or hey, it's a heads up. Yeah, this is the way it was, but this is not good.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a good situation. In fact, again, as history runs its course, what comes out of this are our worst enemies, our worst nightmares. Again, the giant clans who are descended from the Nephilim, according to Numbers 13 and Deuteronomy 2 and 3, that were bent on our destruction. So, the biblical writer wants us to know, A, the outcome of this was really bad, not something we should be thrilled about, and B, this was part of what the Watchers did to help us destroy ourselves. Again, just to turn us into idolaters, again, so that we would be driven from Yahweh, to destroy ourselves, with the way we live and behave, warfare, again, immorality, all this sort of thing. Either way, that we are going to be divorced from the true God. And again, that's what they want. But you're not going to get that impression just reading the Mesopotamian story. You're going to look at them and say, "Oh, aren't these wonderful guys?"
Yeah, yeah.
Look at how they saved civilization. Aren't they wonderful guys?
Started civilization in many
Yeah.
ways. Isn't there their judgment from Marduk? Isn't it similar to the judgment of the Watchers in Enoch?
Yeah, it is. That's the other. I mean, basically, you have a parallel for every point of this. I mean, Marduk. I mean, if you remember the Mesopotamian story, I mean, the Apkallu are, they're not the main deities in Mesopotamia. I mean, they're important again because they're perceived as great, culture heroes. This is how scholars refer to them, because they bring civilization to humans. But when the bigger gods decide, we're kind of sick of these people, these humans, and they make a lot of noise, and so let's send a flood to wipe them out. Then the Apkallu are like, well, good grief, we invested all this time, into this project. You're going to ruin my project. Don't cancel our project. So, they apparently, again, what we have with the text, how else do you become hybrid? You got to merge the species, so to speak. So that's what they decide to do, to try to, again, transmit physically, because humans are physical, they're embodied beings, but to transmit their knowledge and preserve it through the flood. Now they pull that off, and then Marduk, who's the chief god, looks at the situation and says, you guys suck. You should not have done this. Marduk is unhappy. He's really ticked, in fact, and so he sends the Apkallu to the abyss. And there's this line in the Era epic about, send them to the abyss from which they will never return, or something really ominous like that. Basically, you're going to hell in a handbasket here. And so that's where they get sent. They get sent down to the deep dark underworld, and basically they're not heard from again. Now, in the Enoch, retelling, or the Enoch, story, and you also get glimpses of this in the Old Testament. Again, it's not a coincidence in the Old Testament that you get scenes in Sheol, in the underworld, like in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 32. You get scenes in the underworld where, guess who's there? Okay, it's not just the departed spirits of the human dead. It's the spirits of Rephaim, again, who are Anakim, Deuteronomy 2 and 3, and the Anakim come from the Nephilim. Again, it's no surprise that they're there. They're part of this mix, this matrix. So the Old Testament, again, it gives you these little glimpses that these guys, are down there, but it's in the Second Temple Jewish literature and the New Testament where you get this sort of fleshed out more that these are the spirits in prison. Okay, you get the original offenders. All Jewish traditions agree. First Enoch and other Enochian texts, and even texts that wouldn't be classified Enochian. But when you come up with the angels that sinned idea, there's only one reference point. That's Genesis 6, 1-4. The tradition is unanimous. They are in the abyss. They are in the bad place. They are imprisoned, up to quote Peter, in chains of gloomy darkness in the underworld, awaiting, again, the quote, time of the end, or to the end of days, or something like that, to the last generation. They're different phrases. I personally think it's a reference to the day of the Lord. I take Revelation 9. If you read the last chapter in Reversing Hermon, I take Revelation 9 as being a description of the release of the Watchers, basically to wreak havoc for a while before they're ultimately destroyed. But again, you have a lot of the same imagery there: the abyss, the pit, all that kind of stuff. Abaddon is a personification of Sheol, and it fits pretty well. It's not perfect, but again, that's my predilection to read Revelation 9 as their release before their annihilation.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about what Jesus does, the significance of him, and what he does on Mount Hermon. Especially like the transfiguration, some of the statements that he makes, like the upon this rock I will build my church, which if you're Catholic has a whole different meaning, but
well, frankly, if you're Protestant, it's a whole different meaning too. What I do in the book, like the first part is kind of what we've been talking about, sort of the setup, like what's the context here for Hermon, and then the next three parts of the book are, okay, how is Hermon reversed in the Gospels, and then the epistles, and then the book of Revelation. So in the Gospels, I mean, there are things about the birth of Jesus in terms of the circumstances and the timing. And again, I take Revelation 12 as celestial signs for the birth of the Messiah. If you take it that way, you wind up with Jesus sharing a birthday with Noah, according to Jewish tradition, also being born on Rosh Hashanah, again, the day of the inauguration of new kings. And there's lots of images.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, it's really neat stuff. So there's birth circumstances that, again, would have signaled to a Jew, the Messiah is here. Hermon is going to be reversed. Finally, the person here who's going to start rolling back the wickedness of us, of the way the world is. Genealogy, you have hints, but you're asking about, what happens in the ministry. And I think, if I remember right, 3 examples, but we'll take the 2 that you mentioned. So there's a part in the Gospels where, they go up to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus and the disciples. And this is where you have the famous, scene where Jesus asked, who do men say that I am? And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And, Mike's paraphrase here, Jesus says, well, that's good, Peter. Don't get a big head because the Spirit told you about that. You didn't figure that out yourself. So, he says, you've said well, that's the truth. And you're Peter. And upon this rock, I will build my church. And the gates of hell, and unfortunately, most English translations have, the gates of hell, will not prevail against it. Now, there's a couple problems here. Catholics say, well, thou art Peter, upon this rock, Petros, Petra, Jesus is founding the church on Peter, so we should all be Catholics. And Protestants say, no. The rock here is like 1 Corinthians 10, where the rock is God in the Old Testament, so the rock is Christ. It's not Peter, so we should not be Catholics. I don't think either of them are right. Mm-hmm. I think he's referring to where they're standing, okay, because where they're standing is significant. They're at the foot of Mount Hermon, which in the Old Testament times was, again, there was a cult of Baal there. In Jesus' day, it was dedicated to Zeus and to Pan. It's called Banyas in Jesus' day. In this region, this is in the region of Bashan. And if people who have read my book, The Unseen Realm, know that Bashan, of course, is one of the domains of the giants, the last of the Rephaim. There are 2 cities in this region, Ashtaroth and Edrei, that were known in Ugaritic texts, not even in biblical stuff, Ugaritic texts as the gates of hell. So, I mean, to me, I look at that and think, hey, that's probably a clue. like this place has an Old Testament history. Why not think about it in terms of the Old Testament? Because Jesus is a Jew, everybody else is a Jew here. Let's do the math here.
Right.
So again, I think when Jesus says, "Look, upon this rock I will build my church," he's talking about right here. This is where it begins. Right here. This is where the program is going to take hold. And again, the gates of hell, for Greek grammatical terms, a better translation is the gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. It's because there's no preposition there in the passive verb form and all that stuff. You can be bored with that later. But, look how it changes it, though. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well, that sounds like the church is like, cowering in the corner, taking a beating from hell. And, we'll make it because we're the church. It hurts, but we're going to make it. No, if you translate it the proper way, the gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. It's the church administering the beating.
Yeah.
It's exactly opposite. And again, I think that's Jesus' point. We're going to take the gates of hell here. We're going to take the domain of Baal-zebul, which is Canaanite for Prince Baal. Baal-zebul, of course, becomes a title of Satan. Okay, we're right here on his turf, and we're going to make his turf his tomb. Okay, we are the ones administering the beating. And then the Gospels say, well, a few days later, they go up into the mountain. Well, there's only one mountain there. If you're at Caesarea Philippi, it's kind of hard to miss. It's like right on top of you. And it's Mount Hermon. So what happens when they go up into Mount Hermon? That's the transfiguration. Okay, and it's like Jesus revealing himself on the very mountain that everybody who's there with him associates with the Watchers. Again, the first problem, Genesis 3 problem, Lord of the Dead. Well, we just went down there and poked Satan in the eye, and that was a good laugh. And now we're here at Genesis 6. Okay, Genesis 6 territory, the Watchers, and Jesus is revealing himself as if to say, here I am, fellas, do something about it. And then there's this other episode I cover in the book where he goes into Gentile territory. There you get the reclaiming of the nations idea, the Genesis 11 thing. So the Gospels actually hit all 3 of the problems. Again, to telegraph that Jesus is, I'm not just the Messiah for Israel. I'm here not just to reclaim Israel as mine. I'm here because it's all mine. Every last inch of it is mine. And the Gospels actually say when he does this at Banyas, Caesarea Philippi, and up into Mount Hermon, after it's done, the Gospels actually say, from this point forward, he began to teach his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and die. And they're freaked out. It's like, what do you mean? What's this talk about? Like, you got to go to Jerusalem and die. It's like we just kind of, punch Satan in the nose, and now we're punching the Watchers in the nose. This is awesome. But now you're talking about dying? Like, are you nuts? And of course, this is when he rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. And I take that as an adversary. Get behind me, or else you'll be an adversary. Again, that's what Satan means. But anyway, look what happens. They turn, they go back to Jerusalem, then they have the triumphal entry, and a week later he's dead. Mm-hmm. Mission accomplished, because Jesus knows something that none of them know, or none of them do. They don't understand yet. This is what has to happen for him to win. This is what has to happen for the Genesis 3 problem to be cured, because you can't have a resurrection unless you first have a death. So we got to go and die. For the sins of the world, we're going to rise from the dead. Again, eventually, the Spirit is going to come. The Spirit is going to empower us, the new covenant language, again, to fight against sin. There you have the depravity issue. The gospel goes out not just to the Jew, but also to the nations, with the ministry of Paul. I mean, this is the linchpin event. But they don't even get it after he's raised from the dead. There they are in the upper room, and the risen Christ is staying in front of them, and they're like,
Yeah, the doubting Thomas story.
Right. And the text actually says he had to open their minds so that he would understand. And again, I don't want to make the disciples sound like morons. Okay. The issue is, and again, if you read Unseen Realm, you know what I think about this. I think that prophecy was deliberately cryptic, because I take what Paul says seriously in 1 Corinthians 2, that had the rulers of this world known, and that's a phrase he uses for the powers of darkness elsewhere. And Satan is one of those rulers. He's called the ruler of this world. But had the rulers of this world known, what the result of the crucifixion would have been, Paul says they never would have crucified him. Mm-hmm. Again, they're not idiots, but they didn't know. And they didn't know because they're not supposed to know. It's never spelled out clearly in the Old Testament that the story of the Messiah, again, is fractured, fragmented in dozens of places. And it's only after the fact that they can look back on the story with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight and, of course, the Spirit helping them out. It's only after the fact that they can look back and say, okay, that's what this meant. Okay, I see the analogy between this thing and that thing. And they piece it together after the fact, and that is the way it was designed.
And it wasn't collected all in one book at the time.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. It was fragmented by on purpose. So I don't want to say the disciples were morons, but I do kind of chuckle every time I read it, and I guess that's because I have the benefit of the hindsight.
Right.
It's like right. He's standing right there in the room.
Well, let's talk about Paul a little bit, because I wanted to hit on this thing about the head coverings, and there's other things in Paul too that you mentioned, but this I think is the main one, because this is almost like a direct reference to the story. In Genesis 6.
Yeah, and let me caution your listeners. I did a whole podcast episode on the head covering in 1 Corinthians 11. I'm trying to remember what the number was. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and look through the episodes, or search, you can Google it, Naked Bible Podcast, and then put head covering in, you're going to get this episode. If you read this in Hermon, Reversing Hermon, or you listen to it, if you listen to it especially, you might want to excuse the kids from the room, but this is going to sound like the craziest thing you've ever heard.
Oh, yeah.
Until you're on the other side of it, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, if they were really thinking like this chapter makes a lot of sense.
You're gonna love this, Rob, especially since you have long hair.
Okay, so in a nutshell, what's going on in 1 Corinthians 11, and this is based on a series of peer-reviewed journal articles. And I give everybody the breadcrumb trails like I like to do, so they can go look it up. But there's a term there in 1 Corinthians 11 when he gets into the head covering. It's the part where he says that the woman's hair is given to her as a head covering. Okay, and the Greek term there given to her as a covering is parabolaion in Greek. Now, somebody, again, a scholar who I guess who has nothing better to do, actually, his name's Troy Martin, and his specialty is Greco-Roman medical text, so he's like the perfect guy for this. He happened to notice that parabolaion, the same term, is used widely in Greco-Roman medical texts for testicles. Okay, and again, this sounds like Bizarreville, like what in the world? Her hair is given to her for a testicle? Like, what in the world is going on here? Well, again, his series of articles, I think, were fascinating, because he goes back into the classical Greek text, the medical text, including people that we know, like Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath. These were the authorities of the day. And here in a nutshell is what the idea is. They believed at this time that a woman, her hair was an aid to fecundity, to the ability to have children. Again, which to us sounds nutty, because we know about genetics and all this. We can make babies in a petri dish now. Well, they couldn't do that. They don't know about this stuff. But they thought that a woman's hair assisted her in becoming pregnant. So when a man and a woman had sex, they believed her hair sort of functioned to draw up the semen into her womb so that it would assist her in becoming pregnant. The longer her hair was, the more suction power her hair had to draw the semen up from the pelvic region into her womb and then plant the child. And this is why it was wonderful for a woman to have the long hair, because chances are she's going to have children, and we love children. Children are a big deal. It was also conversely why it was a shame for a man to have long hair, because a man's job was to eject the semen, not to retain it within his body. You actually have Greco-Roman medical texts that use the hair length as fertility tests and infertility tests. for women in these ancient texts. So, Martin goes through the whole thing. And I remember the first time I read this, and again, at the beginning, I thought, this is insane. How did this get published? But then when I read it, it's like, holy cow, this just makes sense. I can't believe it, but and I actually wrote to him and thanked him for his article. And I asked him this question. I said, now your article doesn't mention anything about Paul's line in the midst of this, that, about the head covering. Remember, it's like, let me back up. If you think this way, of course, when Paul says, hey, when you go to church and pray, you should have your head covered, women. Well, if you think it's part of your sexual prowess, your ability to conceive, well, it becomes an issue of modesty. And then later on, when he talks about that the hair is giving to her for her glory and a covering, and again, this whole idea of, modesty is still in play because, we have another thought added. Paul said, now you should also, not just because you're in church, keep your hair covered, but you should also do it because of the angels, which we look at and go, we think, oh, it's just a throwaway line, or like, Paul must have lapsed into sleep, or, he ate something that didn't agree with him. 1 Corinthians 11:10, this is a symbol of authority to, on your head, because of the angels. And the idea, again, is still modesty, that you need to be careful, what you do while you're in church. You also need to, again, have, the man that you're with, again, presuming that this is your husband, he is, again, someone that you need to do this to show loyalty to show fidelity to, and to, again, cryptically, you need to let it be known that you're spoken for, that sort of kind of mentality. And so I asked Martin, I said, now, do you think that Paul put this line in about the angels because of the Enoch's Watcher story? And he wrote back to me and he said, absolutely. Now, for this particular chapter in the book, I used a different article by Lauren Stuckenbrook, who's also an Enoch specialist. And he does a really nice job of going through the alternative opinions, and he winds up at the same place. That apparently Paul, by issuing this warning, this one little line in the midst of this passage about sexual stuff, it's not a prophecy that Genesis 6 is going to happen again. Paul's not saying it is happening again, but apparently he was concerned that it could. And so he's like, we don't ever want to see this happen again, because we know how it affected humanity in terms of our depravity. So you better have yourself, covered when you need to. Yes, your hair is for a covering and all that. And it's going to help you, sexually and blah, 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 blah. You need to be modest. You need to be loyal to your husband. Again, you need to not do anything that would, be a violation of the bond with your husband, or flaunt your sexuality, or do anything like that because of the angels. In other words, it's a warning. It's a heads up. It's a boy, we just don't ever want to see this again. And again, that sounds like absolute crazy talk. Again, because we come from a different world. But if there's a theme to what I do, like an unseen realm, and that now this book, Reversing Hermon, you either believe that the biblical writer wrote what he wrote to the audience that he wrote it, wanting to be understood, or not. Do you really want to understand the scripture? If you say you do, then you need to have the first century Jew or the Israelite, whatever is relevant in whatever passage. You need to have those people in your head. Now, you can still get the gospel without it. You can still get important points of doctrine without it. There's some things that are just hard to miss. But if you really want to understand scripture and how passages fit together, you need to understand the conceptual world that they're in, how they think. And that means you got to take scripture in its own context, not the one you impose on it, not your denominational tradition, but the context that produced the thing. And that frightens people on occasion. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I do get the email that you're freaking me out, or this is heresy, or no, it's just the Bible. It's just the Bible. And again, I've said many times on many shows, maybe on this one at one point, but I'm just no longer going to protect people from their Bible. Yeah. I think it's a disservice. It wasn't given to people so that you couldn't understand it, or that there's just parts in it that God, doesn't think that you should be able to understand. That's nonsense.
It makes sense. It makes sense because you have to have it in the context of the time, and you have to have it in the context of the culture. Rob, was there anything that you wanted to ask?
I was going to ask if we could talk about Samson instead. It's a good positive long hair.
Actually, you know what? Two things that come to mind there, because, the whole long hair, that was a disgrace for men to have long hair. Well, Jesus is portrayed classically as having long hair.
Yeah.
But I suppose at the time, I guess that he really wouldn't have had long hair then.
Yeah. If you're I mean, there's a couple ways to look at it. Now, Paul, you have Gentile culture, you have Jewish culture. Okay. Now, Paul, of course, is writing to a Gentile audience.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul is very well read, because he's Paul. He was educated under Gamaliel, but he's quoting Greek poets all the time. I mean, he has the best of both worlds. He's very educated.
He was a Roman citizen, so
He was a Roman citizen. Yeah, he knows his stuff pretty thoroughly. So on the one hand, there is a question of, well, would a Jew have viewed this kind of material again? Would their medical knowledge have either been the same, or would they have bothered to read what a Gentile physician like Hippocrates would say? And it's hard to know again how much they would have imbibed in that literature. Probably depended on how, I hate to use this sort of modern Christian word for it, but how worldly you thought it was. It's hard to tell. Well, the one thing we can know for sure though is that they didn't have advanced medical knowledge beyond the Gentile, and both parties, both Jew and Gentile, do use the same planting metaphor for having children and assessing infertility. There's no such thing as male infertility at this time in either culture, for instance, and that's because
right.
of the idea that well, look at the book of Hebrews. This idea that Levi pays tithes to Melchizedek because he was in the loins of his father. I mean, this idea that you can have a whole human person inside a male, we know it's not correct. If you care about the biblical definition of personhood, and you should care about that if you care about things like abortion, then that statement there is not tenable. I mean, it's a non-scientific statement. But okay, that's what it was. They believed that life resided in the male, and it was deposited, it was planted in the woman, kind of like seed in the garden, and then it takes hold and grows, and then we have a birth. So that if a woman couldn't have children, she had a problem, or either God was cursing her, or there's just something wrong with her. There was no sense that there could be a male problem, because hey, I'm depositing the seed. What else can I do? That's just the way it was, in both cultures. So,
well, it even goes to the modern era, because Henry VIII blamed his wives for not giving him sons.
Yeah, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. In the time that we have left, Dr. Heiser, I know that you got to get going, but I do want to say that you are going to be at a conference in Roswell, New Mexico, coming up very soon. At the end of June. We are also going to be there with our common friend, Guy Malone.
Okay. We'll have to introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, I definitely will. But, I just want to talk a little bit about that and what you might be doing there and talking about there.
Yeah. I mean, I do other stuff besides biblical studies, straight biblical studies. That's my training. I'm a biblical scholar, but, I really care about pop culture, post-Christian culture, internet culture. And for a lot of people, their belief, their beliefs, their substitute for theism, their substitute for Christianity. Their reality is really formed on beliefs about, extraterrestrials, ancient astronauts, that sort of thing. And this is hugely popular. I mean, Ancient Aliens. I shudder every time I think of this, but it's in its 11th season, which just seems unthinkable, but it is. And so I try, to be, a voice in that sphere to get people who. This is their faith, this is their worldview, this is their religion, to at least get them to the table to try to have a discussion about spiritual things, and maybe to get them to think better about the Bible and whatnot. So I have been in Roswell a few times to speak at conferences, and I'm going to be there again the whole time. I think the dates are 29 and 30 June, and then July 1st and 2nd. So I think I speak once each day on different topics like, could Christianity sustain an extraterrestrial disclosure, and why Ancient Aliens really isn't helping you follow, UFO studies, and, just a whole variety of things. What sort of evaluating. I think one talk is evaluating the logic of the defense of the extraterrestrial worldview. In other words, what's the factual material as opposed to the bluster, about it. But I'm interested in it. I don't view extraterrestrials, if there really are extraterrestrials, I don't view them as an inherent threat to Christianity. But I do think stuff like alien abduction and narratives, what aliens supposedly tell people, which tends to be very anti-Christian. I don't think that's the real deal. I think it's something spiritual. And incidentally, that's reflected in something that this is like breaking news on your show here. My employer, the company is called Faith Life, or the makers of Logos Bible software. they have created a 90-minute documentary of me talking about alien stuff, why I do this and what the issues are, specifically spiritually, religiously, theologically. And it's called Aliens and Demons. Now, that is now, or at least as of April 14th, will be accessible to the public, at least the trailer will. What the company wants to do is they've launched a streaming TV channel. So if people go up to, it's a clunky address, maybe I could just give it to you as a link, but it's the word store.faithlife.com and then /aliens-and-demons, aliens and demons with dashes in between there. You'll find the trailer, and it's pretty slick, I have to admit it. I mean, they really have spent a lot of time on this. The trailer is really, it's cool. It's pretty slick, but they want people to watch the trailer and subscribe to the channel. It's $5 a month or $4.95 or whatever it is. Then you can watch the whole thing. And there's a lot of other content on the channel, a lot of teaching content. We have scholars from all over the world, come into our campus, our company, and record stuff that they would teach in seminary, and you can get access to that stuff. So they want to try to kick it off with this and do something a little bit different that might appeal to pop culture. So Aliens and Demons is the title of the film.
Well, excellent. I'll have to sit down and watch that. And when we're at the conference, maybe we could get you to come in and sit down for an in-person interview about it. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, I've told them. I mean, they're doing the streaming thing, but I said, I'm doing the Roswell conference, so it'd be a good idea to put this on DVDs, and I can take some with me. And so they've agreed to produce that. I mean, we'll probably have something there, a laptop or something to play the trailer, but we should have DVDs of it there too. And again, I don't get anything from it. I don't get royalties or anything because this, my salary covers, this kind of effort. But I'm glad they took it on because I think it's important.
Well, excellent, Dr. Heiser. Thank you so much. Where can people get Reversing Hermon and your other awesome books?
Yeah, Reversing Hermon you can get on Amazon. A lot of people have sent me pictures of they found it in their local Barnes and Noble, so you could check that out too. But definitely on Amazon, and all my books you can get on Amazon.com.
Absolutely, and I highly recommend them if you really want to understand the Bible and kind of like its cultural and its linguistic context. Dr. Heiser is your guy. So, Dr. Heiser, thank you so much. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out, and guys, we'll be back to close this mega opus of a show on Conspiranormal.